Welcome back to the Hard Runbox podcast for episode 68. It is a dark, dark day because we are talking about the RTX 5060 Ti, which is, I don't know, not good. Lots of things to talk about. 8 gigabytes of VRAM again, bit of a disaster. Steve has got many thoughts. He even bought one of the 8 gig cards. So we'll be talking about that. It's a really grim one, this one. So strap yourselves in. Let's get into it. I'm going to open up this podcast, Steve, by saying 8 gigabytes it's so back, baby. We are back. 8 gigabytes in 2025. Here we go again. Aren't we just pumped for these great 8 gigabyte graphics cards? Who would have known that these cards, they're still awesome for buyers? Of course, not for the hard unboxed audience because 8 gigabytes it's not for enthusiasts, but gamers love them. Gamers love them, but not for hardware unboxed. But gamers love them. Isn't it just wonderful?
Honestly, I'd already forgotten about all of that. It's just a blur to me. Last few days scrambling to, get all the 16 gigabyte card testing done and then try to track down an 8 gigabyte card, which I've fortunately done as of a few hours ago. But yeah, the absurdity of all of that had washed over me and I'd moved on. But when you said that, I was like, what? Oh yeah, that did happen, didn't it? Well, I know we've already mentioned it. You've talked about the Nvidia, the private meeting we had with them, but we'll have to touch on that again somewhere because that was interesting. Really weird stuff.
Yeah, it was. It was kind of. I mean, may as well talk about this now. What else are we going to talk about? The 5060
sure. Go
Ti
for it.
16 gig. People have probably already seen the review. I'm sure we'll touch on that in a bit. But essentially, with this Nvidia briefing, and we don't want to talk too much about private conversations, that sort of thing, but it's all going normally, right? We were seeing some slides.
Sorry, I just want to say it's private conversation, but they're briefing us. They're passing on. They're essentially trying to train us to go with their talking points or whatever. So the information they're telling us in a way that it's meant to be passed on to the viewer.
Yeah. It's on the record. It's just I don't want to go through blow by blow every single thing they said.
Sure.
It's, the first half hour, 40 minutes is going by normally. We were just sitting there seeing some slides, plenty of marketing BS, the usual sort of thing. We were getting pretty bored by some of it, but whatever, it's that's all happening. And then it gets towards the end, they're showing the specs.
Sorry to keep interrupting you, but we got halfway through and they paused and said, do we have any questions? And you and I were both like, no, this is all pretty typical, the kind of stuff we expect to see from them, frame generation numbers, all that. So you basically straight away said, no, look, I've got no questions at this point in time. Continue with the presentation. And they stopped and they made a cheeky comment. They're like, oh, what, Steve, you got no questions about the 8 gigabyte cards or anything like that? Which, given how it all played out, I thought it was really weird of them to want to have the 8 gigabyte debate or even, I appreciate the cheeky jab. Like I enjoyed that. So I certainly wasn't offended by it. I laughed it off. And I was like, and you were like, you didn't even let me talk. You're like, we're not having Steve argue with you guys about 8 gigabyte GPUs. Tim was like, very diplomatic. He's like, well, no, I think we've all set our part on that. So I think just like, Tim's like, I'm not sitting here for an hour listening to an 8 gigabyte VRAM argument between Steve and the Nvidia employees. So let's just, but in the context of things, it's very amusing that they made that jab comment, which again, I enjoyed it. I appreciate it. I thought it was very funny. But go on.
As the briefing is continuing, we're hearing more about the products and you know how these things go. Well, maybe people who listen to this podcast don't, but usually, actually, people watching this podcast have probably seen a live stream from Nvidia or AMD announcing products. The products are always in the middle to end of the stream. And at the start, it's all the other stuff, right? So it's getting to the end, we're getting some, just bits and bobs about the products, the performance, the pricing, everything. And we had a couple of fairly benign, normal questions to kick things off, just asking a couple of configuration questions. What's the die that's being used, all that sort of thing. And then, towards the end of the briefing, I think you were just trying to clarify a couple of things about how the reviews were going to go, like, what cards are going to be available and when, based on the release dates and things. And then one of the Nvidia employees just mentioned, oh yeah, and when the 5060 comes in, you can just review it, whenever. And I was like, oh, did I hear that right? Did they misspeak and accidentally say the 5060 Ti 8 GB? You can just review that whenever, because that's understandable, right? 5060 Ti 16 and 8 gig launch on the same day. They sample the 16 gig because they want to hide the 8 gig model. So I understand that part, right? But then when they drop the 5060 as well, I'm like, what? And so there was a couple of like pretty pregnant pauses in that discussion where I was just like, so just to clarify here, the 5060 as well, and they're like, oh yeah, but we don't expect that to be a card of much interest to your audience. Like, you're an enthusiast audience. We reckon most people will be interested in the 5060 Ti 16 GB. 8 GB 5060. That's for other people, but gamers love them, of course. They're one of our most popular GPUs. 50 series, 60 series class is at the top of the Steam charts, but it's not meant for the hard. And I'm like, what? Like, I almost didn't know what to say because I was so confused with the reasoning. And then after I think I said something along the lines of, well, if I tell people this, they're going to think that you're burying the GPU. And they're like, no. Just to be very clear, we're not burying the GPU. I'm like, I don't reckon that's true. So anyway, very, very bizarre. Heard a couple of excuses throughout that presentation, but anyway, like, just
Well,
it was a weird
basically,
one.
when we started asking those questions by that point of the presentation, they no longer wanted to acknowledge or talk about 8 GB cards. Like, they went from like, let's have an 8 GB card discussion sort of joke to, at the end, we're not sampling them, or there'll be no review program. So,
Mhm.
and I couldn't help but laugh. I thought it was hilarious that, we just the way it all turned out. So yeah, coming away from that conversation, they told us we were free to review the 8 GB card. They weren't bearing it. They weren't hiding it. They just weren't supplying them. So they turned it on to us. They said, if you want to review the 8 GB card, by all means do so. You just have to go source it from your own contacts, which you're more than capable of doing. So reach out to our partners, your contacts, secure the samples, review them. Job done. Okay. A bit weird the way that we have to go about this, but sure, I'll go do that. So the second the call ended, I shot off half a dozen emails, made a few phone calls around to retailers, distributors, and partners. And all of them started to paint a very different picture. So
Mm.
the retailers were like, well, we haven't even heard about the 8 GB cards. We've barely got information on the 16 GB cards. They're coming in pretty late. Seems like a bit of an odd release. Don't know what's going on with these 8 GB models. So didn't find too much out there. Then when I went to the partners, I got variations of the same sort of message. Essentially, they were like, oh, that's really interesting that you've been told that, because we've been told under no circumstances are we to release any 8 GB retail cards just yet. They're to be held until, I don't know, told otherwise. So they didn't really know why or what was going on there. And then it was almost like me filling them in on our side of the story and what we thought was going on, sort of got them up to speed with what was going on. And the thought was, if I could get in writing from Nvidia, that Nvidia has told us we can go to the partners and get a card from them, that we'd be able to do that. But that didn't really work either, because they were basically under, once we'd done that, so they requested we do that, we did that, and then they obviously went away, spoke to Nvidia or whatever, and they came back and they're like, yeah, actually, that's, although Nvidia's told you in writing that you can get them from us, we ain't allowed to release them, so you're not getting one before the embargo lifts. Like, our hands are tied. And I worked closely with quite a few of their partners, and it was all the same story. Some of them weren't even getting their retail cards into Australia till maybe next week, so from now. So that's just the situation there. Also, if you hear a bit of banging and clanging in the background, apologies. My wife is currently painting the Hardware Unbox gym. And as I said last week, Zoe's having a LAN party in there in a week from now. So we're kind of under the pump to get it done, because all the electrical fit out needs to happen. It needs to be painted before then. So if you hear the odd bang or clang, that's just what that is. It's not someone trying to break in to murder me. It's not. No, I won't say that. I was going to make a joke. Won't say that. So that was the situation. Couldn't get one, which is why I don't believe at this point in time of recording the podcast that anyone has reviewed an 8 GB 5060 Ti yet. But I can tell you, I have one in hand, and I've started testing it. And I've sent some screenshots and some footage to Tim for his amusement. And of course, the 8 GB 5060 Ti is every bit as egregious as we thought it would be.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a really simple question for you, Steve. Why does the 8 GB model exist?
Well, honestly, I don't know. I don't know. And this is, I've been thinking about this with what AMD is going to do as well with like the 9060 XT. Like, I really hope there isn't an 8 GB version, but we kind of already know there is, but that's for a future conversation, I suppose. But why is there one? It's especially for a TI as well. Like, it's kind of only Nvidia would have the goal to put a TI, like a titanium edition with 8 GB of VRAM. But I mean, whenever they do something like this, especially at this point in time, it's more about the money than it is anything else. Like, that supersedes everything else with Nvidia now. It's all about profits and money, and they're willing to sacrifice pretty much everything else for that goal. That's what the company has become. Obviously, they're always profit driven, but it's a balancing act of, keeping your customers happy, brand
money
reputation.
now and money in the future, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a balancing act. Whereas they're really, it seems like, willing to sacrifice brand reputation, mindshare, all that sort of stuff to just basically extract every last dollar. It's like they've checked out, kind of, and from GeForce at the current time, maybe they have. So that's sort of your answer. It has to be money. These lower.
It's weird though, because I would have thought if you just deleted the 8 GB card from existence and you kept the 16 gig exactly the same price, like no change there, surely that doesn't affect their money all that much. Like, I don't imagine the 8 GB card is going to be a hot seller. I mean, maybe in some regions like China that are heavily esports focused, maybe, but
I think it will sell well. And so I spoke with a few retailers, because I think you had the opinion, and there was certainly evidence to support it, that in the end, the 16 GB model outsold the 8 GB model for the 4060 Ti.
Yeah.
Was that your opinion or your thoughts? Like, that was the more popular model?
I think we heard it from a AIB or something.
I think it became more popular after the price cuts, and it was certainly much more desirable and popular amongst PC enthusiasts. So like what Nvidia's talking about. If we polled it, for example, if you were interested in buying a 4060 Ti, which one would you buy at set prices or whatever? The 16 GB one would almost always win, because it's just a better investment, obviously. But I spoke with a few retailers, and they were like, oh, no. The 8 GB model overall, anyway, like the overall sales for the lifetime that the product was selling for, the 8 GB model just annihilated the 16 GB model for volume of sales. So I can't remember the exact wording and numbers, but it was
lowest dollar amount sort of wins out, doesn't it?
It does. So the 16 GB model didn't sell anywhere near the volume of the 8 GB model.
Was it discounted to as significant of a degree in Australia as other regions? Because in the US, obviously, debuted at $500, came down to $450, so the gap reduced from $100 US to $50 US. But was that also the case in Australia? It might not have been. Because if it was anything more than a 50 US equivalent more expensive, there's no way it would have sold. Like, it had to have been 50 or less.
I think it comes back to, because obviously we're pretty laser focused on our enthusiast crowd, the people who seek out reviews and information about this stuff, which really, it's not the vast majority of gamers. So I've got a lot of friends who PC game and, while I'm sure they'd like to support and watch all of our content, they're not really that interested in the PC hardware side of things. So they pretty much come to me. They're like, what should I get? What's happening in the industry? Is there anything exciting? That sort of stuff, that kind of talk. But beyond like, I want an RTX, 5070 or whatever it might be. they don't look at the specs or know anything else about it, and they don't even they don't tweak any quality settings. They don't necessarily turn things on. Sometimes they'll ask me like, what competitive quality settings or what settings do you use? And I get that whenever I stream, people ask that sort of stuff all the time, but they're not really tweaking it and tuning it themselves to work out what settings work best for them. So that poll really did tell us what we already knew, and that is that most gamers aren't super tech savvy and don't care. They're not really nerdy about the hardware side of things. They just want to play their video games and enjoy them. So what they're doing, at least this is what the data suggests. I mean, this is what's happening. I don't know if this is exactly what's happening, but I'll say to a friend, and maybe I don't give them too much information. Maybe I'm not as tech savvy as I think I am. And I'm just like, oh, I've heard, I watch Gamers Nexus. And they said, which they didn't say this, but they said the RTX 5060 Ti or 4060 Ti is a good value GPU. So you just get one of those. They're not too expensive and they'll play the games you want to play at good frame rates. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. Well, that saves me a ton of time. This was all confusing and difficult. You've told me what I need to know. I'm just going to go to my local PC store now and get the most affordable, or the one I like. I like Asus, so I'll get the most affordable Asus RTX 5060 Ti. So they go do that. They sort price low to high. Every retailer has a low to high or high to low way of sorting your search results. They're all going to be 8GB. And if you go to PC Case Gear right now, the cheapest model in stock available to purchase for the RTX 5060 Ti is the Asus Prime model, and it's 719 Australian dollars. It's an 8GB card. And to get to they don't have any sort of sorting between like what Newegg does between 8 and 16GB. But I mean, you've also got to know that there's 8 and 16GB versions to do that sorting. Without that information, again, you're just looking at 8GB cards. So you have to scroll for the model I purchased today. So as I said, the starting price for availability is $719 for an 8GB card, and that's the one I got today. If you want the 16GB version, you've got to scroll down, and it's currently out of stock, but it's $819. So it's $100 Australian more for that model.
So you see that and you're like, oh, why would I pay $100 more?
Well, yeah, I mean, people might not even scroll that far down to you got to scroll through like 2 pages of 8GB cards or 3 pages of 8GB cards before you find the 16GB cards. So
I guess you're suggesting that Nvidia makes more money from the 8GB model than the 16GB card, or the margins are better, or something like that.
I think I think it helps with sort of the positioning and the margins. So if they're able to sell these cards for $719 with just 8GB of VRAM rather than charging $100 more, but then AMD comes in and maybe they have a 12GB or a 16GB model for a similar price, people are going to go, well, do I get the 90? Yeah, do I get, well, historically, because Radeon GPUs have been inferior, they're like, am I buying the Radeon GPU, which is basically the same price as the GeForce GPU? And they're not looking at VRAM. They don't really care about VRAM. They're like, well, do I want the equivalent, in this example, RTX 5060 Ti, if I can get a 9060 XT for roughly the same money, I'll just get the GeForce GPU. I had a GeForce GPU previously. It was pretty good to me. I don't really want to dabble with this Radeon thing. I've heard they're not as good. So it allows Nvidia to compete with AMD while maintaining margins and appearing to be delivering a similar product at a similar price. So I think there's probably just a few wins for them there.
To your point, that's pretty much exactly what happened with the 40 series, right? You got the 4060 Ti 8GB for $400. The 16GB model was $500, dropped to $450. And then AMD's equivalents to that were the 7700 XT at $450 and the 7800 XT at $500, right? So, and again, the 7700 XT eventually dropped to $400. So at MSRP, right, the sensible battle for people looking for a good quality card would have been the 12 gigabyte 7700 XT versus the 16 gigabyte 4060 Ti, which at MSRP made the AMD card $50 cheaper. And you could say eventually same sort of price, similar sort of price. However, by launching that 8 gigabyte card as well, anyone searching for a 4060 Ti actually finds the cheapest models to be $50 cheaper than the 7700 XT. Even though it's not the same card and it's not as good and it's probably not worth buying, what you're saying makes exact sense there, but they kind of hedge their bets between two price points. And so they can kind of respond in that way. They've eventually the 7700 XT became that $400 model, but even then you're still competing at the same sort of price as the 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte. And then what are people going to do? As you said, probably just buy the Nvidia GPU. So,
and the other advantage from a business side is that this ensures that you're coming back much, much sooner than you would otherwise for a new. If you're buying
planned
an
obsolescence,
RTX, it absolutely is. Some people get triggered by that. I don't know why, because that's obviously what it is, and it's very beneficial for Nvidia. It's like a smart business play. If you go buy an RTX 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte today, when are you replacing that GPU? Next generation is the answer.
Immediately.
Yeah, next generation. You've bought a mistake. That thing, can you we'll get into this later, but I mean, I know we've done the VRAM thing to death, but gee, could you imagine buying one of those things today with the hope of getting 4 years out of it, or 3 years out of it, or next week? No, but seriously, like by the time the next generation comes along, you are going to be begging Nvidia for a new GPU with more VRAM. So, I mean, there's a lot of advantages for them. There's really no disadvantage unless there becomes a lot of blowback and pushback from gamers, which is certainly building and mounting. We're seeing a lot more pushback against these 8 gig. Like, I don't magnitudes more than we did with the 4060 Ti. I remember when I reviewed the 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte, I'm like, man, outside of esports games, this thing's going to be very unusable within the next 2 years, and it's going to suck compared to the 16 gigabyte card.
I think your title said so. It was very, very negative. One of the most negative titles we've ever used.
Yeah, and we were right.
I'm trying to find it because you did do a lot of 4060 Ti content. Oh yeah, laughably bad. Laughably bad.
Okay, yeah. Well,
and the thumbnail says Nvidia caught selling trash.
Was I wrong? Yeah. And they're doing it again. Back then, there was a lot of pushback about us saying 8 gigabyte cards were insufficient. They shouldn't be sold for $400. Having said that, I think the whole 8 gigabyte thing was lost on a lot of people, because some people got that we were saying, look, 8 gigabyte cards still work. The workarounds to get them to work aren't too extreme in most instances. The big hang up for us here is, and it's always sort of the nuances that get lost in these things, is $400 US for an 8 gigabyte card in 2023 is bonkers. Like absolutely absurd. That was it was the price that was the real problem. And, you know, now we're seeing 8 gigabyte cards for 719 Australian dollars, which I don't know, that's probably more than a PlayStation or something. I don't know. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. So I think there was a time when your dual VRAM configuration GPUs were much more popular. You'd often see like 2 or 4 gig configurations, or 1 or 2 gig. I think it had its place. It had its time and place where the lower model was acceptable at the time, but then you could sort of essentially spend a small premium to get a card that you'd expect to last a little longer. So it'd often be the case where, let's say you had a 2 gigabyte model, it comes out, it's perfectly fine in the games at that era, and it makes sense at that price. But then you're thinking, okay, well, maybe in like 2 or 3 years, you'd probably want the higher VRAM model, so you can spend a little bit more, and maybe instead of getting 3 years out of it, you might be able to stretch that to, say, 5 years. And that's what you pay the premium for. And there was never a problem back then, because, again, the base model was still sufficient for the time. But
yeah, and
that's changed now.
Yeah, it'd be like, I don't even know if it'd be 12 and 24. They're probably the equivalent to those comparisons would probably be something like 16 up to 32.
Yeah.
Where 32 is absurd. You don't need it. And really, even like the Radeon R9 290, that was a 4 GB card. That didn't really need to go to 8 GB for the 390 for pretty much the realistic lifespan of that product. It wasn't
Yeah.
until we got to the RX sort of 480 and then, the 580, which came with 8. I think that was probably 4 and 8 as well. But it was around those generations where 4 really did start to become insufficient and you needed an 8. So those who invested a bit more and got the 8 got much more use out of the product. But again, even then, it was less of a hot button topic, let's say, because they were pretty affordable. Like you were
Mhm.
talking about a $200 card or a $240 card. So it didn't matter as much. But when you're talking about $400 US cards with 8 GB of VRAM, that's real bad.
Yeah, and I've got some interesting comparison notes here, comparing it to the consoles, because
Mhm.
really it is, the reason why games start to struggle more on high VRAM cards is because of game consoles setting the baseline for developers.
Mhm.
So in the PS4 era, where it had 8 GB of memory, that's the baseline. 16 GB of memory with the PS5, that's the baseline today. And as that keeps going up, it makes it much more difficult for game developers to optimize for below that. And so each time we see this step going from console to console, generally that comes with an increase in memory requirements. So I have some interesting sort of walk back through history to sort of show you very clearly how far behind we are right now, how far behind where we should be.
Okay.
So the PlayStation 4 was released in November of 2013, had 8 GB of unified memory, cost $400 US. Now, if you bought a PC GPU at that same time, at the end of 2013, you had a couple of different ways you could have gone. Now, you could have gotten 8 GB of memory with the highest end cards at the time, like R9 290X had an 8 GB version. But if you were going for a card around the same sort of price, $400 US, you're getting about half the memory. So the R9 290 was $400 for 4 GB. And then right down at the lower end of the market, $200 cards, that sort of thing, 2 and 4 GB models like GTX 760, R9 270X had 2 and 4 GB versions. However, 2.5 years later, fast forward to mid 2016, new generations of cards have come in. Now, if you wanted to buy a mid range GPU around that $400 price, same as the console, you could quite readily get an 8 GB GPU. The GTX 1070 was $380 with 8 GB. You had the R9 390X from AMD, that was an 8 GB card for a little over $400. And then if you want the really high end stuff, you're now starting to get more than 8 gig. So GTX 1080 Ti had 11 gig, right? And then down at the entry level, you had the RX 480 8 GB for $240 or the 4 gig version. And you also had the GTX 1060 6 GB for $250. So essentially, if you wanted an 8 GB card or acceptable levels of memory similar to a console, within 3 years, you were able to get that for 60% the price of the console. So for a 40% lower price, you could have gotten exactly the memory config of the console within 3 years. So pretty good progress there. 8 GB was starting to become popular and available within not too many years after the release of the PS4. So let's fast forward now to the PlayStation 5 era, released in November of 2020, 16 GB of unified memory. And I'm going to say the price here is $500 for the disc version. There is a lower price for the digital version. That price has gone up and changed since then. So if you want to buy a GPU at the end of 2020, very similar to back in the PS4 era. If you wanted a mid-range GPU, you were not getting 16 gig. Options were like 6700 XT, $480 for 12 gig, RTX 3070, 8 GB for $500, and at the entry level, also 8 GB cards, so RX 6600 and so on. If you wanted 16 gig or more, you're talking about higher end models. You're having to spend more than $500. So no problems there. We're in the same sort of position as we've always been, and you wouldn't have seen too many complaints about the RX 6600 being an 8 GB card back in 2020. You move ahead 2.5 years, so same time frame as RX 480, and what have we got? Well, AMD eventually released the 7800 XT 16 GB for $500, so all good there. Same price as the PS5, same memory. That is the limit, because the RTX 4070 12 gig was more than $500 and only had 12 GB of VRAM. And then at the low end, what would you know? The RTX 4060 was an 8 GB product for $300. The RX 7600 was an 8 GB product for $270. So for 60% the price of the console, Instead of getting 16 gig of VRAM, you're getting 8 gig. And that's the major difference. 2.5 years later, after the PS5 was released, we should have been seeing those entry-level cards have 16 gig of memory, which is exactly what happened in the PS4 era about 2.5 to 3 years later with the RX 480. And that's the big misstep that's caused this ripple effect to now, where even today, we're not getting this. The RTX 5070 is still a 12 gig card. You still got an 8 gigabyte, what is it, 5060 for $300? That's crazy. Like that. So the main difference here, right, is the mid-range and entry-level cards had very similar VRAM 3 years after the PS4. Today, there's much more segmentation for whatever reason. And some people, now I want to bring this up as a sort of final point to this. Some people will bring up the Xbox Series S, the lowest end desktop console sort of thing, which has 10 gigabytes of memory and costs $300, right? So if we take what we've been previously talking about, which is this idea that about 3 years after the consoles, you should be getting the same amount of VRAM for 60% the price. What would that mean? Well, that means that 2.5 years after, we should have been getting 10 gigabyte GPUs for $200. Has that happened either? The answer is, of course, no. So no matter which way you put it, and I'm bringing that Xbox Series S thing in because at one point, Nvidia did use the Xbox Series S to excuse 8 gigabyte GPUs. Their reasoning was game developers would have to optimize for the Series S because it doesn't have 16 gig of memory. Pure, blatant excuse. We should have right now, well, we should have had this 2 years ago. Mind you, we're talking about 2 years ago this should have happened. We should have had 16 gigabyte GPUs at $300. We should have had 10, maybe you could say 8 gigabyte GPUs for $200 2 years ago. Today, it should be beyond that or at the very least the same, and we're just not getting that. And so that's how far we've really slipped, is that they're just trying to nickel and dime PC customers. These cards, that gig card is just a complete joke. And there's no angle you can take that says historically it makes sense for these cards to be 8 gigabytes. You're telling me that a PS5 for $500 comes with a CPU and all this other stuff, makes it impossible for PC GPUs to have 16 gigabytes of memory for $500 less? No, it's just not a thing. So that's my rant about and the console sort of comparison there. Because it's going to get bad in 2027 when new consoles come out, 2027, 2028, which is like 2 years from now, and you're talking about people buying an 8 gigabyte 5060 Ti today for 700 AUD, $380, and within 2 years, you could be starting to see next generation games built for a console with more than 16 gigabytes of memory.
Well, that's all part of the plan, though. That's what moves things along. So you've had you've had two underwhelming generations now, and I speak for Nvidia and AMD. They're both pretty well sucked, and people basically, I think, to generalize, people who held out, sort of going, the GeForce 40 series sucks. There's nothing really on offer here. Small to no VRAM upgrade, cost per frame not really improved, underwhelming, not worth it. I'll wait for the GeForce 50 series. GeForce 50 series comes along, it's pretty much the same crap all over again. So some people either just bite the bullet because they just can't hold on to their RTX 3070 any longer or whatever and buy a 5070 Ti, something like that, which in the case of the 5070, that's not going to have enough VRAM either. So Nvidia eventually gets those people. They convince them to spend money and upgrade, and then when the next generation comes along, they're going to be forced to.
The way I sort of see it is that, especially Nvidia, I think AMD is just trying to compete. They're battling and doing whatever they do.
Yeah.
But Nvidia in particular learnt from Pascal. And what they learnt was not what all the gamers wanted Nvidia to learn. What gamers wanted Nvidia to learn was that these cards are awesome, so please repeat that forever. What Nvidia learnt was people held on to their GTX 1070 for way too long. And so what can we do to make sure that people do not repeat that with another GTX 1070 is make sure that those cards aren't as good. And they've basically done that playbook. And the only time that they tried to even give a little bit more than that was when they had the threat of some competition in the 30 series versus RDNA 2. When there was all that chat about AMD might actually be competing at the high end now and all that sort of thing. was ruined by crypto mining, but there was a little hint that they might give you that again. But since that point, since competition's fallen away, and since they've learnt that people are willing to spend more, they're trying to, again, nickel and dime you. They're trying to get you to spend as much as possible on the minimum viable product, which, we've talked about. If you want 16 gigabytes of memory and you didn't want a 5060 Ti, you previously had to spend big on a 5070 Ti. They've learnt all those lessons over the last decade, and that is what we're seeing today with cards like a 5060 8 gigabyte being $300. It's the culmination of all those lessons over the last decade.
Yes, and I would also add, through those lessons, they've managed to kill two birds with the one stone. So they've made they've created a situation where you have to upgrade your RTX 3070, for example, just plucking a GPU out of the air for an example. You need to upgrade that GPU, but they've also killed, or at least greatly diminished, the usefulness of the secondhand market. Because now it's really hard to, like previously when these GPUs like a 1080 Ti, there were tons of people saw the potential of that product. So the secondhand prices of those cards were still quite high. And you'd think killing secondhand pricing and lowering it there sort of makes that market more attractive. But when the product is essentially discounted because it's no longer useful, then people aren't turning to the secondhand market. Oh, I've got to find an RTX 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte. That's such a good buy. So that's basically what's happening there as well. Because I've found at least the secondhand market's nowhere near as compelling as it once was, because people aren't upgrading as often. And because people aren't upgrading as often, Nvidia's trying to force people to upgrade. And by doing that, the cards that they're upgrading from are no longer that attractive in a lot of instances. So it's kind of this weird situation where like I said, they've managed to kill two birds with the one stone.
Yeah, and of course, they're on top of all of that, they're pushing all of their exclusive features that you need to pay heaps of money for. And if they had made these lower tier cards more capable of running those features that they're trying to advertise, then there would just be a lot less incentive to buy the higher tier, more expensive products. Like if a 5060 Ti was actually the performance of a 5070 Ti. So same 16 gigabytes of memory, much more powerful. And this isn't an unreasonable expectation, because the 3060 Ti, back when it was released, was roughly the performance of an RTX 2080. So if they had done that, suddenly you can start using the ray tracing features, the frame generation features they're talking about. You can start really getting into high resolution, high frame rate gaming on a card like that. And Nvidia, they want you to do that. But what they want you to do is to realize those features are good, and you need to spend $700 plus to access them. So if you made that available on a card like a 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte or 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte for $430, again, what's the incentive to spend the $700? They don't want that. They want you to be spending the $750. They want you to spend as much money as possible. And so again, by sort of limiting these products, and I think they're almost offering the 16 gig card a bit begrudgingly. They sort of know, they're expecting at least some competition in the VRAM front in that market segment. They can't just offer the 8 gigabyte card, because then, they get destroyed in reviews, negative feedback. There's potential competition there. So they need to do at least something. And so, they try and make this sort of not great, not terrible GPU. So that is what we've ultimately got. But yeah, I mean, all the features that they're advertising, they're not, and they've admitted this to us, they are not intending everything to be enabled on these products. These products are for people who can't afford the more expensive stuff, they're basically getting a compromised experience. That's the whole point of the product.
Yeah, but of course, Tim, in full transparency and doing what's best for consumers, they're still calling it an RTX 4060 Ti or a 5060. It's still got that RTX branding, despite the fact that it doesn't have enough VRAM in the case of the 8 gigabyte model to utilize pretty much any of those. I mean, you've got DLSS upscaling, which is obviously a benefit, but ray tracing, you doing much ray tracing on an 8 gigabyte card, Tim?
No.
What about your frame generation?
Oh,
How
but I
well?
saw examples. Steve, it's all good to run your frame generation at a base frame rate below 30 FPS because Nvidia showed us that example.
I'd love to see
All good.
the frame time graph for that. But just to get sidetracked slightly, when we were telling people not to buy 8GB 4060 Ti's because the experience would be garbage and they were crap products, and if you have to buy a crap product, get the 16GB version. Now, this isn't exactly concrete, well researched, but I've looked at like the last 15 to 20 secondhand deals on eBay, so the USA, or the
Hmm.
US
Yep.
site rather. Uh, it looks like on average, the 8GB models are selling for about $380 US,
Hmm.
and the 16GB models are selling for about $550, which is, first of all, pretty crazy pricing, but that's looking at the last month or two, so it's the most recent pricing. So if you bought a 16GB model, it looks like you're actually probably making a profit or getting your money back based on that.
Yeah, there's
Which,
started to be inflation because of tariff panic and all that sort of thing, I
sure.
would imagine.
So you on average, again, this is crude. I could be off here, but I'm looking at the last 15, making some rough calculations. Looks like you are making about 45% more on a 16GB card, or recovering.
Hmm.
They're selling for that much more. Whereas at MSRP upon release, so $400 US versus $500 US, it was only 25% more expensive. I say only, that was an absurd premium. And before long, the premium was more like 12%. But
Hmm.
in the current market, you're fetching 45% more for a 16GB model for obvious reasons. The same thing's going to happen with the 5060 Ti, right? If not more
100%.
so.
Yeah, it'll be worse. It'll be worse because you're talking about a market from 2 years after the 4060 was launched. In 2 years from now, you're talking about even more pressure from the games that are available at that time being
Yeah,
unable to be run on an 8GB card.
yeah, and to be clear, Tim and I aren't saying in 2 years you'll sell them for as much or more than you paid. We're saying more relative to one another.
Mhm.
You'll see that 40-50% margin in favor of the 16GB version of the 5060 Ti.
Yeah,
Just
the 8 gig
because,
card will fall off a cliff for sure.
oh, well, it already has. That's the absurd part. And
No, I mean
yeah.
I mean not in performance,
Oh,
but in
all
price
right.
as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well,
resale price.
yeah, that's
But
like one of the biggest GPU. I think of mainstream GPUs. You asked me before, you put it to me, why does it even exist? Why have they made it? And I did my best to answer that. But I would sort of pose the question, or suggest that the 8GB 5060 Ti might be the greatest trap for gamers that we've seen from a mainstream GPU maybe ever.
mhm.
Has there been?
I mean, I'm sure if I went back and I looked at
People
every
might point to
GPU,
like the
yeah.
3GB and 6GB 1060, but a
No,
lot of
the three
people,
gigabyte was usable for
it was
in
a lot
some.
of people consider it even a year after release, 2 years after release, to be a great value product. It
It
was,
was two
look,
hundred dollars.
the naming was atrocious. Same
Yeah,
name, different core
yeah,
configuration. We all agree that's bad, real bad. But the 3GB card did offer a lot of value for a long time. There was no denying that. Same with the GTX 970. It only had the 3.5 gig of
yeah. Again,
VRAM. Not
that card was
at
usable, and yeah.
it was a lot of people, again, it was really a great value GPU that was great value for a long time, and worked well for a long time, or certainly a
Hmm.
reasonable period of time. Whereas the 8GB 4060 Ti was questionable 2 years ago, absolutely awful now, and we're
And it's
getting a
faster. Yeah.
more powerful 5060 Ti with the same VRAM. Like, I I'd love to. I'm really keen to read the comments and hear from people, because I'm not sure we've had a greater trap for gamers, PC consumers ever than the 8GB 5060 Ti. I think it's, I'm ignoring parts like the DDR4 GT 1030, because it's not really while I think that's even worse and more scummy, significantly more so. wasn't really a mainstream part. It was based on a garbage GPU that really nobody who was seriously gaming wanted anyway. But I think for just a GPU generation where the masses are going to spend their money, I don't think we've seen something worse.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been sort of trying to rack my brain thinking about the previous generations, and yeah, there's nothing that comes to mind in that mainstream category where a casual buyer could walk into a store and walk away with a card that is effectively obsolete immediately.
Or requires, because people get really upset with this, or some people will say, we're being so disingenuous or misleading, who uses ultra quality settings at 4K with this sort of product and stuff like that. But again, we're talking about people who are going to not realize there's two different VRAM configurations, and they think, well, I've just spent like 700 over 700 Australian dollars on a GPU. I must have something pretty good, right? That's a lot of money. So surely I can play, like, I don't know, The Last of Us Part 2 on very high settings at 1440p. You can't. You'll see massive frame stuttering and significantly lower frame rates than you would on a 16 gigabyte card. But that's a reasonable enough thing, right? And I haven't actually tested lower presets yet, but
yeah, that's reasonable. And what happens is, in that situation, the person buys the 5060 Ti 8 gig, loads up The Last of Us, cranks it up to a reasonable configuration, and then they don't blame the GPU. They blame the game developer. They say, what is with this performance? What the game? It's broken. It's not optimized. It's obviously a disastrous launch of this game. And you see this time and time again where games come out, and some of the time, yes, there's optimization issues, but a lot of the time it's because settings that should be playable on that sort of card is destroyed by things like VRAM. It happened with like Monster Hunter Wilds earlier this year, where that card runs poorly on 8 gigabyte GPUs. People you go on the Steam community thingo that's available, and people post their complaints or questions in there, and lots of people saying like, why is this game stuttering so bad? And they post their configuration of what they're running on, and it's something like a RTX 3070, which is, again, like a perfectly reasonable GPU. It was a $500 card 5 years ago, so you'd be thinking, right, like it's still got some juice left in that, right? I spent $500 on it, and then it's just not sufficient. And then again, like I said, the game developers get blamed for that. No one's, if you're not aware that you bought the dud card and you just think that I just bought the 5060 Ti, what's going on? Nvidia never gets the blame. So that's the beauty of the scheme, right? Is that they can pass the buck to someone else, because game optimization is a big topic that's constantly talked about. Broken launches are constantly talked about. And we found many examples where if you just had enough VRAM, you fired up the game straight away, you ran on those ultra type settings, you're getting a good experience.
That's absolutely right. And in The Last of Us Part 2, the 5060 Ti at 4K with the very high quality preset using quality DLSS, the 16 gigabyte model's pumping out over 60 FPS. The game looks crisp, looks amazing, visually very impressive. It seems like you're getting an RTX type experience. I know there's not ray tracing and stuff in that game, but works really well. And then you stick the 8 gigabyte version in, and it's a stuttery mess under the same conditions. And even once you drop down to 1440p with quality upscaling, it's still much slower than the 16 gigabyte model and suffers much more frequent frame time spikes. And there's going to be a laundry list of other games that share those same issues, because it's just beyond absurd at this point that we're getting 8 gigabyte cards as powerful as a 5060 Ti in 2025. Like, a 5060 Ti can genuinely be a 4K product without ray tracing enabled, obviously, but 4K quality DLSS upscaling. In most games, you're seeing really reasonable frame rates. Like, it's very doable. And I honestly think 4K gaming in 2025 isn't some sort of crazy
No,
demanding out of reach type resolution. Like, 4K's been around for a long time now. 4K high refresh rate. 4K?
4K high refresh rate monitors are mid-range monitors now.
Oh,
LCDs.
yes, yeah.
You can buy them for like $400 or maybe a little under. I haven't looked recently, but around that sort of price. That used to be 5 years ago your 1440p high refresh. So now that 4K is in that range, that sort of experience is definitely getting cheaper every single day. So the fact that a 5060 Ti with enough VRAM can do 4K gaming that's decent progress. It's just not done in the right way with the 8 GB mole shenanigans. And I think this saga shows, not just with this card, but across the 50 series, how much it's now biting consumers, the shift up in tier that occurred with the 40 series and has been carried over to the 50 series, where effectively every product is priced a tier and priced and named a tier above where it should be. Because if we were talking about a 5060 Ti 16 GB being available for $300 and called a 5060 with an 8 GB model that was maybe a little cheaper than that, there'd be far fewer complaints. And the 5060 Ti 16 gig for $300 would be a very good product. And you start shifting the rest of it, right? 5070 makes a lot more sense as a 5060 Ti. 12 GB GPU would be perfectly fine for $400 and would be offering a pretty good experience. The 5070 Ti shifts down to around the $500, $550 mark. Suddenly it's got 16 gigabytes of memory, an acceptable amount at that price tier, matching the VRAM and price of consoles. And then as you start to get above that, further implications. But the fact that Nvidia deliberately did this tier shift and has maintained that this generation has meant that everything is just totally out of whack. And you can quite clearly see in those examples and just looking at the products, how they're configured and so on, what this lineup could have looked like in an alternate universe where they'd sort of maintained that sort of thing previously. And I'm sure Nvidia would come out and say things are more expensive now, blah, blah, blah. We cannot offer a 5070 Ti for $550. And I'd be like, okay, you just
Sure.
don't want your super fat, engorged margins to be a little bit slimmer. So that's fair enough. That's a legitimate business reason. Fair enough. But they certainly would not be losing money selling you a 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte for $300.
Nope, that's right. And to circle back, the LG Ultra Gear 27GR93U-B 4K, which I'm
Good
know
monitor.
you're
I've tested that. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, I see your face on the product page, so your video is right
Okay.
there. You're giving a very hearty thumbs up. That is it. So that monitor, it costs an additional $200 Australian to buy the 8 GB 5060 Ti that I bought.
So you're saying that monitor is about 500 AUD, and to buy
Yep.
the 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte,
It's just
you
a
have
bit
to
over
spend
700. Bit over 700, yeah. Mine was
Wow,
720.
that's crazy.
So, I mean, that's a 144 hertz 4K monitor that Tim gives the thumbs up and says is good value. 27-inch panel, that's great for gaming. Why is it unreasonable to expect that if you're going to spend $200 more on that new GPU that it can't game at 4K? And it can. That's the thing. Like, it absolutely can. The 16 gigabyte model is very respectable at 4K, especially with quality DLSS upscaling enabled.
And you
You
could
get a great
realistically dump that to performance mode with
yeah,
DLSS 4.
that's right. Yeah, but in quality mode, it's already quite impressive. But yeah, you could go further than that if you wanted to. So, and there's the whole ray tracing thing, but again, opinions vary on this to a degree. Though I don't think my opinions that disconnected from the majority of gamers, and people by and large seem to agree with what I'm saying. And a product like the 5060 Ti, it's not super usable for ray tracing. I know the 16 gigabyte model has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, but it's not that powerful. And again, there'll be people who are like, but I play Cyberpunk using these settings and it looks great and it works. Okay, well, Cyberpunk's probably one of the best examples you can point to. But in the games that you highlighted as being truly transformative, Cyberpunk was one of them, but not with the settings that people would be using to claim that the 5060 Ti can do ray tracing. But following your guide, going on your opinion for what is truly transformative ray tracing, like a genuinely, this looks better with this enabled type experience, the RTX 5060 Ti just cannot deliver anywhere near satisfactory frame rates in the vast majority of those games.
Yeah, its ray tracing performance is more suited to the games where you're forced to use ray tracing. So like a Star Wars
Outlaws, yeah.
Outlaws, Assassin's Creed Shadows, where obviously you want the card to do ray tracing, but it's not, you're not talking about path tracing or those sort of examples. And I don't know, I've just sort of got a hot take here related to ray tracing. I'm not sure whether you would agree with this, but I almost feel like Nvidia's strategy might have changed between when they announced ray tracing and now, because I think back to the 20 series, it's been 6 years now since then, maybe more. When was it? Yeah, probably around 6 years. Um, you go back then, and obviously we had to wait for some point in the future where ray tracing would be viable. And you would think around now, 6 years later, mainstream gamers would be getting a pretty good ray tracing experience, because that's many GPU generations later. And you think back to my example I was just giving about how they've tier shifted the whole lineup. Again, like if a 5060 Ti was actually a 5060, it's the entry level card. It can sort of do some ray tracing games, not great for some of them, more for just those, just games where you're forced to use it. Then you start getting up to the 5060 Ti, which in my alternate universe would have been what the 5070 is. That card can start to genuinely do ray tracing in terms of its performance. Now you're starting to talk about, 6 years later, there's just some reasonable cards you can get that can do ray tracing. But maybe or maybe I should phrase it this way. Has Nvidia changed their strategy so that they're no longer interested about making ray tracing this entry level, like eventually making it for the entry level so that we can move forward into the ray tracing era? Are they less interested about that now and more about upselling you to a card that can do ray tracing and spending more money?
Interesting question. I'm not even sure though. The question, I'm not sure that was ever the case, Tim. It's not clear to me that was ever the case. To me, the ray tracing thing seemed like something they could obviously put the tensor cores and all that to use for, and justify their existence within the product, but also something they could use to crush the competition in benchmarks with, because obviously since day one, and I guess this is something we fought back against, and what caused the sort of situation, let's say, that we had with Nvidia all those years ago. They really did their absolute best to cram ray traced benchmarks down our throat. Like, they wanted reviews, they wanted benchmarks in reviews to be based exclusively on ray traced performance. So your Battlefields, Metro Exodus, all Control, they as close to ray trace exclusive titles as you could. They wanted very few titles that were either favorable or whatever to AMD, which sort of makes sense that they would want that. But they really wanted us to normalize these ray tracing titles and these lower frame rates, and justify to our audience that, I know a moment ago we were going in a different direction where everyone was wanting high refresh rate gaming and we're going for 140, 150, 160 FPS for that really smooth G-Sync, FreeSync experience, that high refresh rate experience. But now ray tracing is so good. It's so transformative. You don't want to play games without those traced rays. 40 FPS is the new 144 FPS. Like, forget about high frame rates, guys. They're not worth it. You want to sacrifice all of that and get these sweet rays. And they were really pushing that hard. They wanted the reviews to be heavily focused around ray traced benchmarks. And we were like, no, we don't want to play games at low frame rates. The hardware's not there yet. It's a tech demo. That's really all it is a tech demo at this point in time. People aren't playing Battlefield with the ray tracing stuff cranked all the way up because the performance the visual improvement is questionable, if it's even an improvement, and the hit to performance is just, it's absurd. Like, I don't know who's doing that, and they didn't like that. And we had they flew over to Australia from the US to have a number of meetings with us, Tim and myself. Do you remember that period where they were constantly wanting to have meetings with us and convince us that
Yes.
we didn't know what we were doing and that ray tracing was the future and that gamers knew this, and we, what were we doing? We were out of touch with our own audience. We really needed to push this ray tracing stuff. So had we done that and had that been normalized, yeah, AMD would have been nowhere. They would have been on like 1 to 2 FPS, while Nvidia was on 30 to maybe 40. And that's what they wanted. But gamers didn't want that, clearly.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that was Nvidia's. Now, this is my hot takes. This is all speculation, just my opinion, right? I think that was the play originally, as in what Nvidia wanted was not really caring too much about the performance, but we need more ray tracing. So the play for that is get people like Hardware Unboxed to focus on ray tracing and talk about it as the future. Game developers will start putting ray tracing into games. All NVIDIA's cards will support ray tracing. And then to do that, what they would have needed to do to make it actually realistic and viable is make the lower end cards usable with ray tracing so that you would actually turn it on. And I think their thinking there was eventually we'll get to having a 60 class product that will be so powerful for ray tracing, and AMD will be nowhere because they're lagging behind on all this sort of stuff. So eventually we'll be able to crush them with a mainstream ray tracing card that will force all game developers to start making ray tracing games, and we'll start the journey. It's a rocket ship upwards from there. And I think we started to see that potentially with cards like the RTX 3060 12GB, which had good levels of VRAM. It was a powerful card in that
There
price
was the
tier.
TI, though, so it sort of undermines that argument.
Well, there wasn't, yeah, but that didn't have enough VRAM, but that was more powerful again. The 3060 Ti 8GB was as good as an RTX 2080 in performance. So it's a huge leap forward in performance. And so if that continued and we extrapolated further from those two generations, the 60 class today would be a 16GB card with lots of performance, and it would probably be pretty reasonable at ray tracing. But I think they've changed strategy once they've realized how much money they can make trying to upsell people into ray tracing. So I think the strategy has changed from let's normalize ray tracing and make it this thing that is going to be accessible for everyone, and we'll push ahead into the ray tracing generation. That's changed to now being, we want you to spend tons of money so that you can actually access the good enough ray tracing experience. I don't know whether I don't know where any of this is true, whether they've changed that position really.
Yeah, I mean, VRAM is a big component of that, though, and the 3070 was just the second iteration of that, the ray traced, the hardware accelerated ray tracing GPU series, and they had to have known that 8GB of VRAM was not going to be enough for ray tracing in the very near future. And it was like, what, a year and a half after that product was released, we found multiple examples where enabling ray tracing just crippled the RTX 3070. And if it had enough VRAM, it wouldn't have been crippled. So it's tough to execute on that plan if the second generation of that plan you're not giving enough of the thing you need for it to work. I don't know. It's a bit.
I don't know. Did they know that ray tracing was going to be this huge VRAM hog back then? Because the games were obviously there was issues outside of that. In some edge case examples with the 3070 at launch, I don't know. Did they think that card would be useless for ray tracing? Like,
well, they had to know when you enable it, it uses more VRAM, right? Like that would have been very self-evident early on in the development phase.
Yes,
I don't know.
The games they had at the time where you could enable ray tracing on those cards, you could run them on 8 gig cards, like Cyberpunk 2077 ran on that card. Your Watch Dogs Legion, Control, those sorts of games, you could enable ray tracing on those GPUs and get away with it. It was actually the other sorts of games where we started to see more of that edge case behavior, some of the non-ray tracing examples, just with standard raster where ray tracing kind of started to cripple the 3070.
Yeah, regardless though, I mean, they've clearly changed strategy. I mean, I'm not even sure you can call it a strategy. The GeForce team might think they're executing on a strategy, but basically it's just a point where Nvidia doesn't care. Like
the strategy is money.
Yeah, and the GeForce team's not part of that. So, I mean, what do you want to do with that? Like, that's just the situation.
And another question I've got for you is, let's imagine that the 8 GB card doesn't exist, the 5060 doesn't exist or hasn't been announced, or maybe has more VRAM rumored or something. Would that have changed at all your perception of the 16 gigabyte model, if that was the only model that existed and we were just talking about, we weren't sitting here going through this whole 8 gigabyte situation again, and it was just the model that was available. So for $30, 16 gig, would it be good then?
I think undeniably the 8 gigabyte model, almost regardless of price, taints the 5060 Ti
Mhm. Yeah.
because it is so broken in 2025 and is going to be so very badly broken in 2027. So I think sharing the same name as a configuration that can be so broken does taint it no matter what.
Yeah.
Now, if the price was $200 or something like that for the 8 gigabyte version, it'd be a bit more forgiving. But it would still be like, well, it just needs to be it needs a different, like it needs to be the non-TI version, right?
Yeah.
At the very least, if not, a 50-50 or something like that. And you can make the joke it's 50-50 as to whether or not it'll work. Sorry, Tim. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, well, I mean, in a way, right? Like you're essentially saying the 8 gig model's tainted it. So remove the 8 gig model and we'd be in a very different position now.
Yeah, I think for the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte, as we pretty much said in our title, it's not a great product, but it's not a terrible product. But ultimately, it's the price that makes or breaks that product. If if it was $430 US in the current market, I'd be like, yeah, okay, I mean, well, don't calm down a bit. It's not too exciting, but if you had to buy a GPU as things stand right now at this point in time, there's really nothing you can get for. I mean, you're paying $500 on eBay
Yeah.
for the 16 gigabyte 4060 right now. So obviously, if the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte came in at $430, it's going to knock that secondhand pricing right down instantly. So again, yeah, I think if you could buy it at the advertised MSRP, people will be like, yeah, okay, that's all right. But we know that's not the case. The MSRP cards are going to sell out real quick in most regions, and I mean in Australia, we haven't even got the MSRP cards in stock yet. Speaking with one retailer, they had 38 different SKUs and only stock for 4 of them. So 4 of the 38 had stock on launch day. And if we go over to PCK SKU right now, I don't even know if they've got any 16 gigabyte. Where are we? 16. They've got one 16 gigabyte MSRP card in stock at the moment, and the other 8 are unavailable, sold out, and then the price climbs from there. Look, somebody got really upset in the comments, and they weren't wrong. They're like, "What are you talking about, Steve? You've lost the plot. Like, you could recommend it at $430 US. Like you're saying, it would be good value there." Not sure I used the term good value. I definitely said I could recommend it at $430 US, and they were saying, this should be $250 at most. And it's like I didn't reply because I was like, I mean, I don't disagree with you, but at the same time, that reality hasn't been a reality for the better part of a decade now. Like, when was the last time an entry level / mid range GPU was good value? Because it wasn't the 40 series. You could argue it was the 30 series, but crypto mining, you couldn't really buy them.
Yeah,
The
the
20.
3060.
So it's like you go back to Pascal, really, don't you?
Yeah, you do. And I think it like it's faster, right? Like it is, as you said, about 15 to 20% faster than the 4060 Ti. So that's better than the 4060 Ti versus the 3060 Ti, which was basically the same performance. But it's not like it's an overwhelming, like, wow, look how fast that entry level card is. It's still slower than a 4070, which last year was a $550 card. So it's slower than that and cheaper, which is like, okay, I guess. Like, yes, it's $120 less than a 4070 cost you, and it's, the value equation is favorable and it's in that position, but it's not like what we used to see a decade ago where this card would be maybe 10 to 15% slower than the flagship of the previous generation, because we used to get the 70 series roughly being the flagship, and then the 60 or the 60 Ti, if they made one, was a little bit below that. And so
Yeah.
the performance uplift could have been really impressive.
And from the perspective of someone coming to you and saying, hey, I want to buy a GPU for gaming, what should I buy? At $430, the answer is, well, in the current market, the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte for $430, if you don't want to spend more than that, that's a part you can recommend. Otherwise, you're going to have to spend, like, do you really want to spend, if it was available again at MSRP, $550 on a 12 gigabyte 5070?
Yeah, probably
So
not.
so then you're looking at going from $430 all the way up to $750 if you could buy a 5070 Ti at MSRP. And once you get to that point, it's like, well, you could probably just go for an RTX 5080 for $1,000. So just you know what I
Slippery
mean? Like,
slope stuff, right?
well,
Yeah.
you're probably not going to go from that to a 5090 for $2,000 if, again, you could buy them for $2,000. This is all predicated on the fact there would be availability. And
but that's what Nvidia wants, right? They want you to argue yourself into going from a $400 card to a $1,000 card.
Well, I mean, that's what you're looking at, though, right? Even if you look at the MSRP, I know the difference between $430 and $1,000. Obviously, more than twice the price. Very big gap there. But if it's someone who's like, okay, well, I do have a little bit of disposable income. I really need to be talked into this. Ideally, for this hobby that I do, on the side, I could justify $430. I could afford $1,000. I can't justify it, though. So I need to be talked into that. Like, $430 is what I'm comfortable with. What am I getting for that? And then you look at it and then you're like, well, yeah, if I spend a bit more money, then I get, but even then, like, Nvidia sort of shot themselves in the foot, because you go to a 5070 Ti and it's still 16 gigabytes of VRAM and you're paying quite a bit more money, but then it is quite a bit faster as well. So, and then even if you arrive at $1,000, you're still only getting 16 gigabytes of VRAM, which is certainly acceptable. I'm not suggesting that 16 gigabytes of VRAM is not acceptable. I think that it's like this weird thing where 16 gigabytes of VRAM is perfectly acceptable, but it's also kind of the minimum you want. So it's like a starting point. And then realistically, I think you could say right now at this point in time, there is one VRAM configuration, which is probably the problem.
Yeah.
You don't want less than 16 and you don't really need more than 16. And will you need more than 16 gigabytes of VRAM over the next few years?
It depends what the next generation consoles are looking like, right? Like, if we're talking they're 2 years out and you're spending $1,000 and you want to keep that card for 5 years, I think it'll probably work for a few years after those consoles, but it's questionable how.
That's what I was going to say.
It's a complete unknown. You'd be much more comfortable with 24, for example.
Yeah.
Like, that would give you that peace of mind.
Sure. 16 gigabytes of VRAM is almost without question going to be satisfactory for the next 2 years. I think almost certainly for the next 3 years. And then 4 years is where it starts to get a bit like,
Yeah, not sure.
But you're probably on a 4-year-old GPU, you're no longer just cranking the preset up anyway. You're probably quite willing to downgrade it 1 or 2 notches, which would see 16 gigabytes of VRAM just fine. And that is the thing with VRAM. Compromising on quality settings because of your VRAM configuration is perfectly acceptable. It depends on a few things. One of them being how much is spent on the GPU, which was the hang up with the $400 8GB card 2 years ago, and then how old it is. Because while the 1080 Ti was a fantastic product and aged really well, 5 years after release, people weren't just cranking the settings to ultra and being like, what's wrong with this thing? Why is it not spitting out over 100 FPS? So as the card ages, you are willing to accept that you can no longer just max out the quality settings like you would today on something like an RTX 5090.
Yep.
So that's why I think 16 gigabytes of VRAM will age really, really well, because in 4 years from now, it's going to be okay. It's going to be acceptable to go like the second highest preset. you don't want to be spending $400 today and having to deal with medium or low type presets in a lot of the games. Like you don't want that to be your
Mhm.
starting point, because essentially what that means is in 3 years from now, 8 GB cards are going to be as useful as 4 GB cards are today. Have you tried gaming on a 4 GB graphics card? It's not a fun time. Not a fun time.
Yes.
Even 6 GB of VRAM today is not a fun time. All our RTX 2060 owners, fans, enthusiasts in the while listening to this, that I'm sure they'll well, if they're not just playing esports titles, they'll know the pain of trying to get 6 GB cards to work in your titles like Space Marine 2 and stuff like that. Can be done,
Yeah.
but requires some work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the position that we're in now with the mainstream market is very much just a big factor in it is the lack of competition that we've seen over the last few years. I think, the RDNA 2 era which was the last time that we got products like an RTX 3060, which I think in hindsight, looking back on it, a lot of people would say was a really good quality mainstream product. While it was probably a little more expensive than you'd used to see for a 60 class GPU, and price to inflation these days would be a $400 card. But anyway, good quality product. Since then, just the lack of progress and competition in that sub $400 market has meant that Nvidia's been able to get away with releasing these 8 GB models, the stagnation in performance, the 40 series offering no real performance improvement, the 50 series giving us about 20% more, but then that's relative to a really bad generation and doesn't really give you, a huge performance uplift or anything. Obviously, the VRAM concerns. If there was a product in this price range that was broadly available, performed well, had good features, and had enough VRAM, and was doing what gamers wanted, it would be just incredibly difficult for Nvidia to get away with products like a 5060 with 8 GB for $300. If there was a $300 16 GB GPU today from AMD in that price range, I think it would destroy the 5060. I think people are now at the point where you can't just DLSS away 8 GB. So the advantages of getting DLSS in your 5060 are fully mitigated by the lack of VRAM. They're fully countered by the lack of VRAM. And so, I'm sure in the future we'll be talking more about the 9060 XT, this talk of it having 16 and 8 GB versions. Hopefully, if there is a model that's below that, so as 9060 non-XT or something, because I don't know what price ranges they're going to be
They'll want to be
marketing these
paying
cards at, but
attention. Yeah, it can't be more than $200. I know it will be,
yeah,
but
but a 9060 non-X. I'm assuming here the XT model is a 5060 Ti competitor. There'll be a non-XT model that'll be a 5060 competitor or something along those lines.
yep.
Sure, they can do the 8 and 16 gig for the 9060 XT. The 8 gig's pointless. Shouldn't release it, but there's the 16 gig model. If AMD comes out with a 9060 16 GB for around $300, it will smoke the 5060, and it would be the stupidest move by them, knowing everything they know right now, to release that card as an 8 gig card. Just put the 8 gig card in the bin. Just bin it. Get rid of it. Focus on the 16 gig card. And I think that will change a lot of things in the market. And I wouldn't be surprised after that you'd see much more VRAM for next generation cards from Nvidia.
Yeah, well, I think they will anyway because of the next generation consoles and whatever. But that's that's something for the future. But AMD really have another big opportunity here to,
Mm-hmm.
I think, repeat the success of the 9070 series, but I think more so. Like I think to an even greater degree.
Yeah, for sure.
And they're only using GDDR6 memory. They can do this.
Yeah.
They can do this. The cost isn't crazy or anything. It can be done.
I would fully expect so. I think the key for them, as we've talked about earlier in this podcast, was how the 8 and 16 GB models have allowed Nvidia to hedge their bets when it comes to the competition, so that if, for example, if there was only the 16 GB 9060 XT and they priced it at $400, then Nvidia would have the cheaper model. They'd have that $380 8 gig card to sort of confuse people with. So provided that AMD can counter that sort of hedging a little bit, especially if they could get the 9060 XT 16 gig down to around $350 as an example, the 5060 Ti series, whole 5060 series is dead. Assuming that it performs about the same as a 5060 Ti. Like if it's in that ballpark of performance, it's cheaper, is offering you that 16 gigabytes of memory. Like at $350, why would you buy? Like we don't even know the performance of a 5060 8 gigabyte, but I'm telling you right now that it would make absolutely no sense to buy that for $300 if a 9060 XT was a 5060 Ti-ish performance for $350. It would just kill that whole series. And then obviously there's room to produce cards below that price, but that is an opportunity for them because the 5070, it's somewhat more reasonable than an 8 gig 5060 Ti. The 5070 Ti is obviously, they're competing there against a good quality product. It's obviously not the best in terms of its performance uplift and value and that sort of thing, but it's not a 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte. So the competition they were facing for the 9070 XT was stronger, in my opinion, than what they'll be facing with the 9060 XT. And so, as you say, like the door is just wide open there to create that product that we've been talking about, the mainstream GPU that does what gamers want.
Fingers crossed, we'll see what happens there. But for now, we've got the 8 gigabyte card to have fun with, so we'll be doing that early next week. And
I'm keen.
It'll be something, Tim.
It will certainly be something. All right, unless you've got anything more that you'd like to get off your chest about the 5060 Ti 16 gigabytes so far, we will take a break.
No, I think we've said it all.
All right, let's do it. Let's take a break. We'll come back and we'll talk about our boring lives. And we're back. Because we totally just took more. We definitely took a longer than 10-second break just then. What is going on in your life, Steve? What has been happening?
I posted a few photos in the Hardware Unboxed Discord, the BTS section of the gym build, because it's getting very near completion now. As I mentioned, touched on very quickly earlier in the podcast, my wife is currently painting it, and she's still out there painting it. She's been doing it for hours now, so great work from her. We're under the pump to get this done because next weekend will be Zoe's LAN party. So I've got a lot of work ahead of me. I started on the side while I was testing GPUs and stuff to add a third monitor set up, and I was getting computers configured. Remember we built that streaming PC for the Hardware Unboxed channel with the 2 capture cards. It was a Z690 platform. Anyway, it had a Core i7-13700 in it. It's been a reliable system, never skipped a beat for us. We almost never use it. The last time I got used was because Zoe, the last school holidays, came out here to use that big OLED screen I got from you. Just playing Spider-Man on that, and it worked flawlessly, no dramas. And I plugged it in today, went to install a few games that the kids want to play, and it just blue screened and reset. I was like, oh, that's odd. It's never done that before. Anyway, long, boring story short, I still haven't fixed it. So I changed the processor. I've changed the power supply. I've changed the memory completely. I've updated the BIOS. I've changed everything but the SSD and the motherboard. So my next step's it's got an older Corsair MP500 2 terabyte SSD. I don't know if that's the problem or not. I'm going to put in a fresh SSD in, fresh Windows install, see if that solves it. If it doesn't, the motherboard's my last port of call, which will be a pain in the butt because then I have to replace the motherboard, but whatever.
You've got a fair few of those, so I think you'll be all right.
Well, it was more that I've got to get about 10 systems set up and working for this event. And the first one I tried, which I thought would be my most dependable one, complete chaos. I was like,
just blame it on Windows 11.
Well, I'll let you know what it is when I work it out, but I wasted a few hours on the side today trying to sort it out, and so far I got it. So it was crashing in the stress testing that I was doing within 10 minutes. When I changed the CPU, I was getting it out to like 40 minutes. So the 10-minute crashes were actually better because I could try a thing like, is it the power supply? Put in a brand new one. Within 10 minutes, it crashes. Okay, change the memory, set all that up. Within 10 minutes, it crashes. I'm like, okay. And then I, changed a few other things, and then I got it out to, I think it was the processor. I don't know for sure, but got it out to like 40 to 60 minutes, and then it would crash, which is way more annoying. But it seems to crash most often when I'm doing a lot of like writing and reading from the SSD. So
Yeah.
I think maybe there's something wrong there with the SSD, but no idea at this point in time. So anyway, that's one of the side projects I'm working on, is setting up a whole heap of PCs. I ordered some extra peripherals and stuff from PC Case Gear, and yeah, they'll be doing it in the gym before the gym becomes a gym. I'll probably order all the gear for the gym just before we leave to Taiwan for Computex, so that way when I get back, everything should be ready to be delivered, because it'll probably take a week or two. It'll be quite a sizable order of gear, because we're going to fit the whole room out. Balin's done all that. Balin loves his bodybuilding and stuff. So I'm like, work out what we need, Balin, and yeah, give me some little dumbbells and I'll try and lift those. So that's the plan there. But the plastering and all that was done last week. So as I said, that's getting painted now. We got that done by some professionals. They did a really good job. Looks awesome. Externally, I cladded it, obviously, so it's all done. It's all weather tight and all that. I used a product called, I think it's James Hardy board. It's like a linear board type thing. It's fiber cement, basically. So it's like good for fire resistant, weathers really well, all that sort of stuff. So, but it's a pain in the butt to deal with. So you got to wear like full PPE stuff. So masks, goggles, all of that, because the fibers in the cement fiber stuff called, what is it? I'm losing. I'm too tired, Tim. What's
Like they
that
get into
thing
your
that?
lungs, right? Like
Yeah,
silicosis or whatever it's called.
silica type issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going for. Thanks for the help there. So you've got it's like very serious stuff. Cancers and stuff are involved as well. So got to wear all of that protection when cutting it. Doesn't matter whether you're doing one cut or 20 cuts, you've still got to put the full PPE gear on. You can't breathe that crap in. And even wearing like the goggles, the mask and all that, I just hate doing it, because you feel like after half an hour, you feel badly sunburnt, because it gets into all like the pores of your skin and dries them out straight away. Seems like a windburn type sensation. So anyway, I had to do that for 2 days. So got it all done. And no dramas there. I'm really sensitive to that breathing stuff as well, because I get like what they used to call seasonal asthma, and like the hay fever type stuff. So anything like that, if I even breathe in a tiny bit of it, screws me up for days, and can't read scripts and stuff. So anyway, did that. Looks great. It's all been painted now. So that was probably one of the jobs that I was least looking forward to doing. That's done. Feel for the guys that do that every day, because you just get you cut like, I don't know, 10 boards and you're just head to toe gray. Like it's like
Yep.
someone dumped a bag of cement over your head almost. It's that bad. Anyway, obviously I set the miter saw up so it was blowing away with the wind, but you still get you still get covered in it. It's just, even when you pick the thing up, it's not a fun time. So I'd much rather. Well, I do enjoy doing it, but you know what I mean? Like some of the jobs, there's aspects of it you're like, why am I doing this? I should just pay someone else to do it. But
Yeah.
it looks really good. It's come up really well, so I'm happy with that. And
Nice.
we've done a few other little things here and there. But yeah, like I said, the photos are in the Harbour Unboxed Discord. I'll probably have to add some new ones shortly. But other than that, I don't think I've not been doing any air shows or racing events or anything like that. I've been really back to my boring life of just benchmarking and building. That's really it. That's all I've been doing.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, I went to Werribee Zoo.
Oh, okay. The girls want to go there real bad.
Yeah, so it was one of my relatives, like a little kid's birthday, turning 2. So we went out, decided to go to Werribee Zoo, which Melbourne has a couple of different zoos, but this zoo is particularly unique because it is more of an what's Werribee Open Range Zoo. So instead of having like each animal in a sort of relatively small enclosure where you just sort of walk around, you sort of stand, you look, and you see the animals. The animals are in much larger open plain areas and are often mixed together. So
Mhm.
they've got basically like these bus trips that you can go on. And so you sit on the bus, you basically drive around kind of like a simulated African savannah. You go out and you see.
You're on like safari. Tim had his hat on
Well,
and everything.
basically, that's what happens. You see giraffes, you see the rhinos, you see the wild beasts or whatever, all in the same area. And I hadn't been there for a long time. Like, it would have been since I was a little kid since I went there, and all I remember back then was they have meerkats right next to the cafe, and you go on a bus and you see some things, right? And honestly, going to the zoo as an adult, I've been to the zoo a few times as an adult. Eventually, as an adult, you kind of seen all the animals, right? Like I've seen a giraffe, I've seen a lion, and all that sort of thing. I really thoroughly enjoyed going to Werribee Zoo, doing the little safari bus trips and things, just because
Okay.
saw the animals much closer than you would normally. The giraffe, you're going out in this bus is sort of going slowly. Giraffes are walking past, which is really cool. And my niece was getting really excited just seeing those animals in the wild, getting to see a rhino and stuff. And also, normally when I go to the zoo, the things I want to see, it's kind of cool to see a tiger and a lion and that sort of thing. But they're always hiding away somewhere in sort of
Mhm.
just the middle of nowhere. Got to see all of those animals this time. They were all there ready to be, just lounging around, seeing them. So saw some of them on the bus, some of them in just the normal part of the zoo. And yeah, it was really cool. And there's multiple different bus trips that you can do at that zoo. So there's like a free version where you go around and it's just, just a normal one. There's, more special more private ones, smaller buses with less people. We didn't do any of that private stuff, just the normal entry admission free bus. And yeah, went around, saw some things. They had this really cool elephant enclosure. When we got there towards the end of the day, they were moving the elephants from one part of it to another part and feeding them. So they're up and about doing stuff. And yeah, it's honestly probably one of the best zoo experiences that I've had since, seeing zoos as an adult. Like, just cool stuff, really. So Werribee Open Range Zoo, highly recommend going there. I still think it is better than just the normal Melbourne Zoo. Melbourne Zoo is a
Mm.
great zoo as well, but the Werribee Zoo was really good in my opinion. So take your kids there because I think they'd love it. It's a
Yeah,
bit further away for you. It's a bit
that's all
closer
right.
at my way, but just love the open plain experience where all the animals are together there. Sometimes you see some of those zoos and like the animals are in such a small area that you're like, oh, that must be like really depressing for
Mm.
a lion that's supposed to be roaming around in this big wilderness area.
Yeah,
And
I
then
agree.
Werribee Zoo's got like, hundreds of acres, I think, for animals. So it's really cool. So and the tour guide on the bus that was going around and saying things, he was actually quite a funny guy. He had a whole bunch of material lined up, jokes about animals. The kids were loving it, and he was giving some great information about the conservation too. So shout out to that guy who's doing a great job. So yeah, Werribee Zoo. I've been
Nice.
to I've been to a few zoos recently. When I was in Perth last year, went to the Perth Zoo as well. Werribee Zoo smokes the Perth Zoo. Perth
Ooh,
Zoo pretty average. Werribee Zoo great. So
up your game, Perth.
yeah, that's right. Sorry, Perth
Now,
people.
well, yeah, I'll definitely be doing that sooner rather than later. Yeah, my wife and the girls have been talking about doing it, but we've always found something else to do. But yeah, we'll have to make an effort to get over there because yeah, it has been something we've talked about doing quite a few times.
Great experience, in my opinion. But yeah, anyway, that's probably going to do it for this week's episode. We've been talking for long enough, and it's like 9:30 now p.m. So we're
Well,
ready for.
I can't wait to read all the comments about, oh, stop talking about 8 GB of VRAM. We get it all, blah, blah. You guys are going to love it because I'm pretty sure next week's podcast is going to be a big old deep dive into more 8 GB goodness. Tim might try and come up with another topic, or really, I think sort of the world has to do that for us. Come on, world, come up with a topic. But yeah, strap yourselves in.
It's going to
There's
be a fun one.
more VRAM to come, or less, depending on what you bought.
All right, let's end the podcast. If you want to get the ad-free version of this podcast, you want to support Hardware Unbox, the channel, we get our Patreon page. Links to that will be in the description of the audio version or the video version. Like I said, you get this sort of bonus feed, which is ad-free. We've got our Q&As that we put in there. We get our monthly live streams. They're put in there as well. And obviously all the other Patreon benefits you get. So it's well worth signing up. Apart from that, thanks for listening to the whole entirety of this podcast and our talk about the 5060 Ti. I would have loved this first part of the year if we had gotten all these nice positive podcasts that we could have lined up talking about how good all of these graphics cards have been. But unfortunately, most of them have just been, as you put in your review, which I think you stole from me, a bit of a turd sandwich. So
I did that's funny you mentioned that, because when I said the turd sandwich part, I was like trying not to laugh, saying because it's so childish. And I said to Balin, I'm doing the turd sandwich for Tim. He is going to love. Tim loves a turd sandwich. Loves it.
Well, I mean, not in the way that you could read into that.
No, but
it's just a great phrase, mate. You
love the phrase a turd sandwich. So when I said it, I was just thinking of you the whole time, and I was trying not to laugh because it's just it's so childish, but it worked well in that context.
It's funny that you had put that into your video, and I picked up on it straight away. I'm like, you've definitely stolen my material on that one and put that one in on purpose, because, and this is fully sidetracking the end of this podcast, I've been playing a lot of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 lately. Yeah. And one of the things that the main character, Henry of Scarlet, says a lot is, "Are you yanking my pizzle?" He says that so many times. I guess it's like a medieval version of, "Are you yanking my chain? Are you having me on?" sort of thing.
Yep.
And so he says it, and every time he says it, I'm like, that is such a very silly, very funny phrase to say. And I was almost going to put that in to the news video about the RTX 5060 when they were talking about all their BS reasons that they were giving. I was just going to throw in what's going on in the video? You're trying to yank my pizzle or something? I almost,
you should have.
I almost did it, and I'm like, I don't know whether I should say pizzle on the channel. And I decided at the end of the day that I would not say it. But I kind of regret it now, so I'm just getting it out there in the podcast now. The first ever yanking of the pizzle is in this podcast. Official Hard Unbox canon now. Anyway, so
we have a new turd sandwich. No,
turd sandwich.
Completely different context, but
I feel like Nvidia really is yanking our pizzle with this 8 GB stuff. Anyway,
with this turd sandwich.
All right, that's in the podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week.